Hello and welcome to a very special release of WhyWork. This is a live podcast recording performed at the New South Wales Mechanical Engineering Safety Seminar Series, MESS 2024. Don't overcook the chook. Don't undercook the chook. Just cooperate with others, consult and get it right, says Trajce. It's not date night gone wrong or salmonella, teases Sara. What you've created manifests in new dimensions. Errors carry with you. In this special episode, the team traverses design failures in the engineering universe. Let's make this simple, says Alan. Take reasonable care that your actions do not impact adversely on others. But if you plead guilty, you cannot complain about the outcomes of being found guilty. Coulda, woulda, shoulda, challenges Trajce. This episode discusses design thinking and strategy in mining. It provides case studies on mining equipment and systems design, examines design-related flaws in equipment and systems, and looks at enhancing system design resilience by addressing ongoing communication and improvement needs. Section 22 of the Work Health and Safety Act is given the spotlight. And of course, listen to Trajce get very excited about demonstrative pronouns and modal auxiliary verbs contained in that provision. And remember, none of the things discussed today or points raised or made should be construed as legal advice or any other type of advice. We're just here to talk about all things work-related.
Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind.
Hello, and welcome to the WhyWork Podcast, a series of playful dissections on the most curious and alarming events in the world of work. The podcasters Girle, Trajce Cvetkovski and Sara Pazell debate how to craft a better experience of work. Sit back, relax and enjoy.
Righto, my name's Ross Stutchbury. I'm a mechanical engineer with the Resources Regulator. I'm really excited to kick off this session. I think it's going to be great. And first time for the Resources Regulator, we've got the WhyWork Podcast, presented by Sara Pazell, Girle, Trajce Cvetkovski. So let's get started.
Let's get started. Who's going to start this? We're going to start this.
The WhyWork Podcast invites you down a sinuous path to explore and uncomfortable realities of work and the stuff that can go really wrong. Alan and Trajce dismantle case law, and Sara prompts us on how to redesign the world of work. Please welcome to the stage Sara, Alan and Trajce.
Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Create a new path.
Thanks for that, Ross. I was having a Trump moment then. I got up there and started dancing. And thank you for playing one of my songs. I think I've just earned 0.02 cents on Spotify.
It's on Spotify.
This conference is paying for itself already. I've earned 2 US cents. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our session, the WhyWork Podcast session. We are podcasters. This is pretty much our fun job. We look for the most bizarre legal cases. We don't find too many in mining, but they're starting to make their way onto our roster. We've been invited today by the Regulator of New South Wales, thank you very much, with respect to looking specifically at what I regard as the most complex and spookiest section in the legislation, Section 22. It's scary for me, so I imagine it'd be scary for non-lawyers. So we're going to talk about Section 22, but we're going to try and also, I guess, encourage you to embrace that piece of the legislation. And Alan's going to talk about some cases, and Sara's going to talk about how you can create a greater impact and become a value-adding engineer. But before we commence with all of that, look, we acknowledge this is a very serious business. I've done my fair share of prosecutions that have resulted in fatalities. So we acknowledge that this is quite a sensitive topic and a daunting topic in itself. And in many of those cases, I was reflecting that quite a number of these, the issue of poor or manifestly inadequate design came across my table. Our focus, whilst we're calling it don't overcook the chook, but we're also going to talk about when you undercook the chook, which is what happens most of the time in these fatalities, but we're going to look for that sweet spot, that Goldilocks, get that balance right. So that's what we're going to hopefully try and achieve today.
And for you all today, while we're presenting, this is actually one of the podcast episodes. This will become a podcast episode. So anything you ask us today, you're part of that episode, all right? Those who want to speak up, please do at the end. I think my job is more about rabble rousing. So let's talk a little bit. One thing you did this morning is brilliant, is your acknowledgement of country. And when we're presenting, I like to just pause for a moment and reflect on the fact that we can learn from Indigenous cultures in as much as being custodians of really good design, being caretakers. This is a premise that I think I just want to acknowledge. It came through this morning as something we can just pause and think about. Any decisions you make, any actions that you take, anytime you are affecting and impacting that work, you can be a custodian, you can be a sponsor of some really good design, whether it's machinery, work systems, or environments. We're going to show a little bit about us. We'll explain again, each of us, who we are, and then we'll go through some cases.
Let's get started. Who's gonna start this? We're gonna start this.
And today we're speaking to mechanical engineers.
Yep.
Trajce, tell us about yourself.
Well, before I say that, I was going to say, wow, we've just crammed 6 seasons in about 2 minutes, which is pretty good. We're pressed for time.
And the WhyWork Podcast has made Australia's top 40 management podcasts and the Australia Apple podcast, top management and top business, top 10. So check it out.
I am a full-time academic now for Australian Catholic University. I run the postgraduate program in occupational health and safety and environment and management. Prior to that, I worked for Work Health and Safety as a prosecutor for 13 years, and I've been a lawyer at the bar since 1996. This really converged because Alan and I know each other. We've known each other for a long time. I didn't realise that Alan and Sarah knew each other, and it was just this delicious convergence of a meeting of the minds. So here we are.
Tell us about you, Alan.
So my career of late is as a defence lawyer. I've been doing that for a long time, defending people against people like Trajce. And that's been great fun. The world of safety, whether you're looking at work health and safety or any of the other safety legislations, is constantly growing. So we're seeing new and exciting things all the time. And when Trajce and I were talking, we wanted to bring those legal issues into a forum where they can be talked about by everyone, where they can be discussed in a fun way while still trying to be respectful to those people that were impacted by incidents.
And my world in human factors, human systems integration, and acknowledgement to Robin Burgess Limerick, who was my PhD supervisor, some alignment there, is all about designing work, that work is a viable design medium in all of its complexities as an ecosystem, whether it's the environment that you're designing, the capital equipment that you bring into the system, the jobs that you design, the training, all of it can be designed incredibly well. And if you're going to integrate changes in technology, changes in systems, changes in environment, you need to understand there's people and process. And at the heart of every system are humans. That's my focus, and a little bit of a rabble rouser too.
Indeed. It ought to be a cosy group. We all know everyone, name dropping. It's a Queensland thing. In any event, I just realised it is a bit 1 degree of separation. So today we've been invited to just focus on one industry, the mining industry, with a specific focus on the mechanical aspect of it. But for me, it's important when we talk about case law and case studies, lawyers shouldn't and lawyers do not monopolise the law. It's a social good, it's a social responsibility. Part of the goal of this podcast is to encourage non-lawyers or those who are interested, and you should all be, we're all contained within the iron cage, which is the rule of law. And the more people appreciate, look, this stuff is really, it affects us all, that's part of the message of our podcast.
We've got some Slido questions.
Yeah.
So, for all of you, what does overcook the chook actually mean in mining equipment and systems design? You got to go to your Slido, right?
Yeah, answer that.
Overloading equipment and pushing it beyond its limits, over-engineering, getting distracted, you're cooking a meal for your date night, excessive equipment use without any maintenance or replacement, and or all of the above. So let's see your responses. Can you change your responses?
That's interesting that no one's got date night.
Yes.
Yeah,
one person.
Date night.
That's right.
They really overcook their chook.
Yeah.
You must be good cooks.
And I've got to explain, because this is broadcast around the world. We've got listeners in Kazakhstan and,
Uganda.
Ohio and Uganda. That's right. What a chook means, Trajce, tell our overseas listeners, just because this is a recording for podcasting.
Chicken.
The chicken, mate. The chicken. Your chook is your chicken. Right?
Not a bin
I've been
chicken,
in Australia
but
long enough to
but a
know that.
chicken.
All right, guys, reflect a little bit. What's overcooked the chook mean to you?
Well, I'm liking what we're seeing here, the overdoing it, the over-engineering, just the over-design, and sometimes it's a status quo. Why are you doing this extra bit? Why are you adding this extra concrete, all this extra steel? Well, usually it's always been done that way. It's just the status quo.
Or something I hear you talk about all the time, Alan, why are you writing more policies and procedures just for the sake of having those tick the boxes, right?
Yes.
That's something that defence lawyers often...
Yes, absolutely. If you're writing policies and procedures, that's not a bad thing, but make sure that you're following them.
I'd be encouraging that rather than considering overdoing it just because it's the way it's always been, or this is what my mentor told me when I was a junior, just add that extra bit, just add that, consider what is that, own it, have the courage to go, you know what, this is enough. Because there are considerations beyond this design. There could be environmental considerations. There could be cost for the clients. Why am I adding these extra holes if perhaps I don't need to add these? So what we're suggesting by the title is to consider being efficient, lean, and essentially ripped and not upsized. Like me, upsized.
In the human factors world, when you think about overcooking the chook, you often think about having so many alarms and alerts that cognitively you cannot process, you do not know what's most useful, and you start to just, ignore them, right?
Yeah.
It's white noise now. So that happens a lot in mining systems, mobile plant equipment, environmental designs. It becomes meaningless.
Yeah. And indeed, if you think about your the person for whom you're designing, let's say they've got to drill, 1,000 holes I'm making this up, 1,000 holes at 20 mils when perhaps 800 holes at 16 mils diameter may have been fine. That poor person drilling and all those ergonomic factors, stop, think. Did I really need to do 20s when I could have done 16s?
But you said it before, it's about the Goldilocks just right degree, right? So let's ask you now about what does undercook the chook mean in mining equipment and systems design?
Educate your mind, 'cause the system keep you blind.
That'll be easy, because Alan's going to talk about those.
So the options are underutilizing design strategies, just not using them to the full potential. And I could almost add to that about not cross-purposing it across the business, right? Under-engineering designs that minimally or just do not meet those performance standards, overly cautious maintenance schedules, low-use equipment, or salmonella, mate. We're at the edge of our seats so that we can really see the responses coming in. Oh yeah, we got some salmonella. Do you want to comment on this at all, Trajce, while the responses are coming in?
See, the overly cautious maintenance, that's that conservative element. I understand that. That's your profession. By nature, you would be conservative.
But the risks of that are that you're no longer being productive, right? So you're just doing your job for your job's sake as opposed to really understanding what the work objectives are and the key strategic initiatives.
These results are about right in the legal setting. The cases involving poor or manifestly inadequate or just bad designs would fit in the first cluster in the 67, so you just haven't done this to spec. And it's interesting that it's such a high mark, but it's also interesting that the underutilisation and that overly cautious maintenance, you may have done yourself a mischief by not getting that correct amount. In the previous slide I'd mentioned about overdoing it, but you can also get it wrong by underdoing it. That's where the cluster of problems occur in undercooking the chook.
And I see with underutilizing design strategies, so often an innovation has been crafted somewhere else and nobody else knows about it throughout the whole organization. And you're losing that opportunity to benefit across your organization, but also learning across multiple industries, really studying success, that aspect, and just being creative enough to think about something outside the box. I see it in inviting new technologies, and it just stays in a single business unit as opposed to moving across, even if it's something phenomenal like extended reality, right? So the answer to all of this was all of the above, but all of your answers are pretty good. You can't go wrong with that, right?
And they're good answers because the law is asking you not to do any more or any less than that mantra-like phrase, doing what is reasonably practicable. So under is obviously unreasonably and impractical. Over, I'm suggesting ask yourselves, be this efficient value-adding engineer and say, do I really need to? But the undercooking is where there's that failure in reasonable practicable. It's interesting, I don't know if you wanted to talk about section 22 at this stage.
Tell us about section 22.
Chafing at the bit. I need to talk about this. As I mentioned right at the outset, this, certainly for me, in terms of syntax and grammatical context and setting, I've no idea who drafted this. I don't believe it was a coincidence, no pun intended. I believe it was by design. Boom, boom. I believe it was deliberately done to be a very wide casting provision because it does more than talk about reasonably practicable. It's, first and foremost, the head of this section. It starts with duties of persons conducting businesses or undertakings that design, plant, substances or structures. So immediately when you use that demonstrative pronoun, it's an inanimate object, that. Oh, that's a PCBU. All right, well, whew, I'm off the hook. I'm not a PCBU. And you think, well, you might be a worker, but we won't go there, but that. So immediately I think, oh, okay, this is about that. But then the pronoun shifts. You get to part 1, subsection 1, the section applies to a person. That's still okay, because persons can be corporate citizens. A person, the designer. Yeah, right, it still could be a PCBU. No, the designer who. So suddenly you've gone from that to who, and who relates to a human, no pun intended. So
What?
human, who, human. So that and who, to me, suggests that it's a wide provision with seriously wide implications, and it's ongoing because this particular section, unlike the others, they're throwing in things that are called modal auxiliary verbs like could reasonably. Not just reasonably, could. And we all know what could means. Could, would, should. They don't use the word would or should. They use could. Stop and think about what the word could means. It could, but it mightn't. It may. When? Don't know. When it's going to be decommissioned? When it's going to... Don't know. It uses the word could. And I suggest that little word is a powerful word.
Trajce, you said something earlier about engineer being ripped, the abs, right?
Yeah.
Now, bear with me for a moment here. Let me unpack this, this six-pack, because you said to us earlier about doesn't matter if you're a mining engineer, doesn't matter if you're a mechanical engineer, doesn't matter if you're an electrical engineer, what type of engineer are you ultimately? If you're tested by the rule of law and in work design, you are a value.
Oh yeah, I mean, you're a very competent engineer, that you tick the professional box, but you're a value engineer. You can demonstrate that you have added value. You've added value to your work personship, you've added value to your client, you've added value to the community because you have created that design that has that lasting, or as you always say, enduring impact.
Do you have the enduring impact? Is there value of your designs?
Yep.
Alan's going to talk to us a little bit about some case law to explore this.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Trajce, we're supposed to make this simple, so let's make it simple. The law is always expanding, and there's lots and lots of cases coming in about people who are professional designers, which includes engineers, but not just engineers. And we're seeing within that group of professional advisors, we're seeing lots of cases about engineers. There's lots and lots of cases about engineers, and it was easy for me to find cases about engineers. And for those cases, they're often not charged with those specific offences like 22, although it's useful to reference to them because that talks about designers. Often what will happen is individuals get charged as workers, and every worker has an obligation to take reasonable care that their actions don't impact upon others. It doesn't matter what legislation you're looking at, but under the Work Health and Safety Act you would see that. So if you want to make it really simple, everyone in the workforce has to take reasonable care. You have to make reasonable care that their actions don't adversely impact upon others. And if you're a designer, you have to take reasonable care that your actions don't impact upon others. All right, let's have a look at some cases.
I agree. I'm going to interject one more time. Yes, all the other cases talk about reasonable. If I had a Spotify cent for every time I use the word reasonable, I'd be a billionaire. This section, Alan and Sarah, not only does it use the word reasonable, as I said, it uses the word could, it also throws in terms such as proper. It also throws in words as conditions and purpose. My point to this is the meatiest, ripped, buffed work health and safety section, or potentially, in the legislation. It's got the reasonable, but I'm suggesting to the audience, it's just got that little bit more spice.
Educate your mind, 'cause the system will keep you blind.
All right, well, talking about spice.
You see what I deal with all the time with these two?
Let's talk about a South Australian case dealt with in the industrial magistrates.
We're in South Australia.
By an industrial magistrate. And this is a reported decision, so there's nothing confidential. I'll not say some names just as a courtesy, but we can freely talk about this case. It's a prosecution of 3 entities. There were 2 subsidiary companies of the business A&G Engineering, and there was a third company that operated a winery that operated as Wiri Wiri Winery. And what had happened was Wiri Wiri Winery was already set up and going, making wines. They make beautiful wines. And they put in some fermentation containers, or vats, I'm going to call them. And the fermentation tanks, they were quite large. They were, if you measured from the ground to the top of the tanks, it was 7.7 metres, and I think there were 6 in a row. Imagine, shiny stainless steel tanks.
That's a lot of wine. That's kind of your playground there.
That's a lot of wine.
That's a little bit of your playground.
on grounds of incrimination, I'm not answering that question.
It gets worse.
It is South Australia, so good wine, okay.
The wine was spilt. And so what happened was the fermentation tanks were built and then they fell over. And I'm going to go through those facts in a bit more detail. So what happened was the first subsidiary company of A&G Engineering was engaged by Wiri Wiri Winery to design the fermentation tanks, which it did, and their design was good. The second subsidiary was engaged by Wiri Wiri Winery to install the tanks. And there were some issues about the installation, but that wasn't really the underlying problem. The underlying problem was that they put these fermentation tanks on an old concrete slab, and the old concrete slab wasn't strong enough to hold the fermentation tanks. What happened after they'd been installed and they'd started to fill them was there was some cracking noises. And then luckily one of the workers on top of one of the fermentation tanks saw the concrete crack, screamed out. They all started running. A few workers on top of the fermentation tank started running along the walkway. Most of the workers got away with virtually no injuries, but one worker suffered very serious injuries. He was the one who saw the crack forming and screamed out. Now, there's lots of issues in this case. There's lots and lots of issues. The 3 companies pleaded guilty, which I always find fascinating when companies plead guilty. There's 2 things that come out of that. If you plead guilty, you can't complain later on that you've been found guilty. You have your opportunity to contest the charge. If you don't contest the charge, then you can't complain later on that you've been found guilty. So that's I always find that interesting. But this case also raises another thing which is really interesting about when you're designing, don't just think about your own particular aspect, because that's what went wrong here. They didn't think about, can the concrete slab support these fermentation tanks?
So I'm sorry, I'm not a structural engineer, nothing close to mechanical engineer, but even thinking about having a spa and a sauna in my backyard, that's like my dream, right? The second level, the grass. The first thing I ask the guys is, will that have the right footings and support? Will that be strong enough to support what I want to build back there? Last year I was at MESS 2023 and I had to walk across the stage, right? And today I'm wearing boots because last year I had high heels and I just sunk. I stuck all the time. It was quite entertaining for everybody as I'm trying to walk across, and I usually walk and move a lot. But you've got to be thinking like the foundation of that, the environment which you're building. And that happens in mining. You hear about equipment being jacked, right? And it's on you think it's a compact soil, and machinery is pretty damn heavy.
Yep.
I was at the hairdressers the other day, and the neighbor across the road, they said, you know what? That guy just narrowly escaped. He was fixing his car, changing tires, had it jacked. He had it on the lawn, though. It was a big four-wheel drive, and he'd been underneath that vehicle, left, and it had fallen off the stand, right? Because it sunk. So this is what I think I'm hearing you say. Is that the same analogy with these wine vats? Is that they didn't check, people constructing it didn't check the context of the environment in which it was being used.
And I think what happened was everyone was thinking it's someone else's job.
Yes.
Someone else's job, right? Yep.
There's this disconnect. The Japanese have a great term for it. We use the term consultation in the law, communication, conversation, call it what you like, that introduces another C word. The Japanese engineering industry, if you like, or the community, the association, they use the word cooperation. It sort of means the same thing, but there's this level of cooperating from you, the drafts person, you who's done this, and right through. So from that theory to praxis, there is that level of cooperation. So when it got to the VAT stage, that engineer's, it wasn't just the engineer's DNA from the plant, from the drawings and putting a rubber band and fold away. That person would be there, perhaps on site, just making sure that legacy, and I use that word carefully, because unlike other types of jobs, when an engineer designs or creates something, that's not the end of the story. And post-commission and decommission and on, your work, if you like, it's quite active.
That's right. The legacy you've talked about. We've talked about being value engineers, right? And right at the beginning, when I asked you to think about some of the indigenous cultures, we talked about being a caretaker and a custodian of good design. So you're a sponsor of that project that never ends, right? In human factors, we say it's continually tested by design and use. All these different scenarios that were unimaginable. You try and imagine as many as you can, but things always surprise you, right?
Yeah. So
WTF, what? Didn't expect that, right?
Exactly. And it's sort of that disconnect, I find, can lead to serious mischief. So you're there in your office, wherever you are, you're doing your thing, and you're competent, and it's there, and all the you've pressed the right sign and the right COSTAN and the right things have spat out of the printer, it's all good to go, but it's not. Once that person who's the next person in that chain of responsibility, if you like, I'll call it a causational chain because that's what lawyers like to use. In addition to reasonable, they use the word causation a lot. What you've done, what you've created, it starts to manifest. So from the theory into this practical three-dimensional design, if there has been an error along the way, that error sort of kind of carries with you.
So in this case, who was found at fault or who admitted to guilt?
Well, the subsidiary of A&G Engineering, the first one, ended up being fined $135,000.
Right.
The second subsidiary of A&G Engineering was fined $108,000, and Wiri Wiri Winery was fined $112,000, but there's more. Now, this case was back in 2010, so, translate that to maybe double the amount today. Both A&G subsidiaries were ordered to contact all their clients and tell their clients about the case.
Wow.
And there was also one individual engineer who was named in the case, who was a courtesy I won't name now, but he was criticised in the case. Now, he wasn't a party to the proceedings, so there was nothing he could do. So he's now on the public record, easily discoverable, and has been criticised. So again, if you plead guilty, you're stuck with the outcome, and you always have to make these decisions very, very carefully.
What I noticed about the Weary Winery, which I love saying, I want to say like 3 times fast, Weary Winery, Weary Winery, Weary Winery.
Yes.
What I love about the WWW is that they were contrite, that they really tried in every way possible to look after the family, and that was noted. They had a 20% concession in some of their the penalty, but they were also made an example for industry. So as good as they had been trying to be, they were said, look, we're giving you a discount, but we're still going to give you a hefty fine because people need to learn and we want you to be the example. The engineering company, who actually weren't engineers but used the term engineer in their title, were given a 10% discount, if you will, for just pleading guilty and saving court fees. But essentially, if I were Weary Winery, I would be thinking, I'm hiring an engineer. They should be knowing they know what they're doing. How would I know that I've got that responsibility, right?
Yeah,
That causational chain, that web is so complex.
So I would suggest when you're designing, these aren't my words, it's straight out of this piece of this juicy section in the Act. When you're designing, just waiting for a bit of silence, not a pin to drop. When you're designing, you design to the conditions. You don't design sort of in that abstract theoretical context. You design to the conditions, and those conditions, whether it's a winery, a mine site or wherever, you've got to be active. And this is this part about this, this idea of being a present in the moment, if you like, professional, a present in the moment mechanical engineer. You're designing to that condition. And of course, many of you are obviously nodding and going, oh, duh, of course we do that. I'd say, well, do you? Because Alan keeps trawling more and more cases because we're going on to another case.
Educate your mind, 'cause the system keep you blind.
Yes, but you just don't want to be that one person.
And I just find so many times that environmental engineers, people designing the workspace, the mechanical work bay, this building, this room, are often not put in touch with those who know what tasks occur in those spaces, all the scenarios and the varieties of those scenarios. And then the people with the capital equipment equally are not having those conversations with the environmental designers and the people that know all the work that must be done. And this nexus is a huge opportunity to bridge that gap if you want some resilience in your design strategy and you want reliability. And that's that perfect tension of knowing what was successful, what can erode performance, what are the signifiers of when performance erodes, who does that information get to, how much time do they have to respond, are they the right people to make the right decisions, and can they make a decision that will actually be beneficial? Will they have the right information to make those decisions well, right? So, and how is that system rebounding to reliably still get wine in your vats available to the consumer, to all of you tonight for our dinner? Those are the kinds of questions we got to ask.
Talk, cooperate with all the parties involved in the creation of this thing that you're creating. Don't just say, I've done my job. It's it. Sorry, speak to the hand. No. Keep the conversation going.
But that's how our contracts are designed, right? So this is what I would love to change, is that we have a work design council, not just risk compliance councils, not just legal councils, sorry boys, but you actually have a design council, because our contracts are designed for, I'm the project manager, I'm handing it over to you.
Yeah.
Sweet.
That's it.
And operations says yes, and now it's operations problems, right? That's how a lot of our contracts are designed, and that's not going to satisfy. What you're telling me is that to be an effective designer, that loop has to continually happen.
Of course, put your contract aside, because the other thing about this legislation is it's a non-delegible, non-outsourceable duty. So you have concurrent. Alan just mentioned 3 people who were pinged. These are concurrent duties. So you could have the employer, subcontractor, engineering firm, and so on, and so on, and so on. These are layered duties. So a contract might say, yeah, but the contract said, that's it. I've just done my job. That's it, I'm going home. yeah, fine, the contract says that, but the regulator doesn't, mate. And that's the heart of the matter.
It's the commercial reality versus prize, and also what was your goal in the first place? What target did you want to hit? Let's be winners. Let's hit those targets.
Yeah, and to be winners, consult, talk, communicate. That would be the one thing I would want you to take away from it is cooperate with each other and talk about it.
You have another case?
All right, let's talk about the second case. So
this one will hit home.
This one again is a very interesting case, and again it's a charge brought by SafeWork New South Wales against Komatsu Proprietary Limited, and Komatsu pleaded guilty. So Komatsu was, of course, convicted and fined and is stuck with the outcome of that decision. But as I read this case, I couldn't but help wondering what would have happened if Komatsu had contested the charge. The case arises out of a commercial agreement that Komatsu entered into with Viola, and Viola purchased 6 items of earth-moving equipment, and amongst those 6 items was a bulldozer which looked very similar to the bulldozer you see on the screensaver when we're in the lunch breaks. There's a little rolling screensaver which shows the number of earthwork machine, and it's the sort of bulldozer you might see particularly on a quarry, but maybe even on a mine site. Anyway, as part of the arrangement between Komatsu and Viola, Komatsu decided to add to the bulldozer a belly plate. The purpose of the belly plate was to protect the equipment, the mechanical equipment of the bulldozer from muck and dirt that was kicked up underneath the bulldozer. And as part of that design, what they did is they hinged one side of the belly plate. The belly plate weighed a bit under 300 kilograms, and they hinged one side. It had 6 bolts. I think it might have been 6 bolts on either side of the belly plate. And so when the 6 bolts, when the hinge was on, when the 6 bolts on one side were undone, the belly plate could fall down and then you could access the inside of the bulldozer. Now, what was interesting, another interesting aspect of this case is Komatsu also had a maintenance agreement with Viola, and Komatsu sent out one of their maintenance workers to go out to Viola to maintain the bulldozer. That worker went out, did the maintenance job on the bulldozer, and then Viola said, "Oh, look, we'd like to clean the cooling," I'm looking for the exact words, but for the cooling equipment inside the bulldozer, and the Komatsu worker agreed to do that and undid the belly plate. Now, it must have been a big machine, because what the maintenance worker didn't know or didn't realise was that in addition there'd been installed inside the bulldozer an industrial hoist made by the company Warn, W-A-R-N, and it had a metal rope that was attached to the belly plate, and it could be lowered down on the hoist and then lifted back up again with the hoist.
I'm so glad we're talking to engineers, because they can get that visual.
Yeah.
So
Anyway, the job got completed. They cleaned all the cooling gear and the cooling system, and then the cooling system was reinstalled to lift the belly flap or the belly plate back up. The Komatsu worker attached the hoist to the plate, lifted it up, got it back into place, and then set about putting the bolts back in to secure the plate into position. Whilst he was doing that, the wire rope broke, and the plate fell down upon him, and he suffered terrible injuries. I won't go through the injuries, but the end result was he was no longer able to work. The Komatsu did have what they called golden rules, which is a phrase you often hear used by mines. And one of the golden rules was to not go under a suspended load. And of course, the belly plate was a suspended load. And that's exactly what Komatsu's worker did. He went under the belly plate, and as the evidence came out, he knew of that golden rule and knew that he was not following the golden rule, but he didn't have any other systems in place to go underneath.
And I just want to highlight this because we talk a lot about elimination of live work and that you need to be away from live work, and you've got golden rules everywhere in mining about stay away from live work, where you could have something fall on top of you, you can have hydraulics go wrong, you can have electrics go wrong, etc. But this is an issue that we're talking about in industry right now, in the mining industry, with the Earth Moving Equipment Safety Roundtable, for example, where you've got planned, scheduled tasks that are still exposures to this hazardous energy source. And we go, yeah, sign this dotted line that we won't be exposed to live work, but anyway, you got to go do this job, right? So there are planned and scheduled tasks, oftentimes where you are around suspended loads, like in tire handling. And to be able to see the thing, to talk to people, there are folks around, any person around this exposure. So here you have this case really highlighting this.
Yes.
You gave me a Miley Cyrus song.
The Wrecking Ball.
The Wrecking Ball.
But before we do that, I'm a little bit confused, Alan, by that case. Where's the design thing come into it? To me, it sounds like a worker's gone under and the plate's fallen on him.
The education and the training, right?
Well, what happened was in Komatsu, in designing this system for lowering and lifting the belly plate, didn't think about the human involvement.
There you go.
Didn't think about the work.
Yep, gotcha.
Okay.
No, that wasn't a loaded question. I was confused. I thought, where are you going with this, Alan? And now I know. Okay, this is getting back to that conditions and know your product as the
People and process, right? And knowing what people need to. Do they have the right information to make the right decisions and use everything that you're putting in front of them, right?
There are other quirky things too, like Komatsu used a thicker rope, wire rope.
Okay.
But because which you would think would make it safer, but the thicker wire rope was actually more dangerous because
overcooking.
The winch.
Overcooking.
They overcooked.
Overcooking the chook.
And because the rope was thicker, it was more prone to breaking than the thinner rope. So
the best intentions, but plans mislaid.
And part of that introduction of new technologies into work systems is doing a lot of focus group iterative trials until you have more complex scenarios tested out in reality. So somewhere in that there's been a disconnect, right?
Yes.
Yeah, disconnect,
Now, look, in relation to that case, I want to just talk a bit more about the way the legislation works, but they ended up getting a $375,000 fine imposed by Her Honour Justice Strathdean. Now, that's a significant fine in itself, $375,000, but of course it's reputational damage. Komatsu had 8 other bulldozers, exactly the same around Australia, which they had to attend to. But since this case, so this case was in 2020, there's been a decision under the National Heavy Vehicle Law of Girle, which you'll know about, which talks about Category 1 charges, and Category 1 charges are much more readily available to regulators now. So Komatsu was charged with Category 2. Under Category 1, you've got up to, depending upon the legislation you're looking at, 10 million as a maximum fine. And of course, there's jail sentences for individuals involved.
But also the stigma of being accused of being reckless. That's what the 31 is. It's a reckless.
Gross negligence or recklessness.
Think of the term, or gross negligence.
Just as bad.
Reckless. It's go back. It's a medieval term. Reckless. It's not good.
So when you're thinking about including technologies, integrating technologies in work systems, there are 3 main questions when you're going through the phases of this. It's, first of all, is there a way? Basic human research, the fundamentals about do things fit and what are the anthropometrics? What's the evolution of humans? How do our eyes see? How does our neck move? What are our reach envelopes? Real basic stuff about how humans are going to interact with that system. And then who are you including and who are you excluding, right? So that your workforce strategy teams will want to know that. Are you building for the 5th to the 95th percentile of their body types? Are you building for folks who have different cultures, people who can interpret, and do they need to know English language? Whatever it is, you've got to specify who are you including, who are you excluding. That's the human part. And you start go through, if there's screens and monitors, does our visual perception system accommodate that? Do we have certain sensory processing needs profiles where we can interpret things based on our sensory world, where all of us vary quite a bit? Number one, basic human research. Is there a way? And then can you play? Can you play is the fun stuff of doing the mock trials, the simulations, the animations, testing it out in lots of different scenarios. Like I said, well, cool, you thought it would be nice to have a thick rope there or, extra millimeters, but is that actually going to be well? And you talk to domain experts like all of you and people who work in the field, right? Is there a way? Can you play? Third question, can you stay? And that's the part that's often missing that we talked about, is going back and testing it in realities of systems all the time in different scenarios. Can you stay? This worker was with this belly plate, right? I'm feeling like a bit of a belly plate right now sitting here. This worker had a belly plate, but I didn't have the proper training, didn't have any way to really understand it, and was just told to make do, right? Get exposed to live work, make do, understand it without proper training protocol, from if that case is understood to be correct.
Well, they didn't ask the big question, which often fails to get asked, which is, what happens if it fails? It's a really important question to ask.
And I like to,
what happens if it fails?
What happens if it fails? And I like to also say, what happens with success? What does success look like? Because oftentimes we're not tracking our success and success across multiple industries. What does success look like, feel like? How's it tangible? What are they doing? What are the inputs for success? And how can things fail? And that's that perfect balance for the good system design, right?
Sweet spot.
That's sweet spot.
So if you want to add value, just know what's happening on the ground. Be invested in who's using your product, whether that, as you mentioned, if it's a human factorial aspect, whether there are language considerations, right through to weight and sheer size of the thing that you've created. That's investing in what you've designed. And it's not just a feel-good, warm in a glow to know, wow, I know I've got those workers' backs. It's actually a legal responsibility. But if you can combine all that would be a key takeaway message through that level of cooperation, through whether it's a focus group, through exchanging ideas and information at this type of forum. That's how you know that you're going to meet those reasonably practicable thresholds and those could words and proper and all those other words that feature in that section.
Educate your mind, 'cause the system keep you blind.
And it's good evidence if you can demonstrate, oh yes, I was invested in this, I was a value engineer, I added value to this project.
I love it. Are you a value engineer, right? We didn't include that in the Slido, but we've got another Slido question.
Made it up. It came to me in epiphany. It's here. It's here.
That was his midnight shower. They're value engineers, right? He's all excited.
After a few Wirrawara wines. Yes.
A Wirrawara wines.
I've seen the light and it's a value engineer. Yes, indeed. So that's how I'd see it, yeah.
Those little animals, those were our spirit animals in that video, by the way. I'm supposed to be the little rebel rouser, you're the deer. Yeah, I'm supposed to be the rebel rouser otter and the owl, the wise owl. I don't know if that already came out to you.
Spirit animals, they're a thing. Even the skateboarding people training the Olympics were talking about spirit animals.
They're a thing.
It's a thing I didn't know.
So I'm curious to understand about your impression of being a value engineer. We do want to ask you some questions. We do want to hear from you about any of the cases that we've talked about whether anything resonated. There's another Slido question that we can pop up for you.
Have you had some similar experiences, the so-called near misses? Has something struck a nerve, or it's a matter for you? But just remember, you don't have to say anything, but we're capturing this for the purposes of a bonus podcast. I'm going to edit it with some music.
This is a big question.
Yeah.
This is a really big question.
So, if you don't want to be part of it...
Read it out, Alan.
When does your liability for design finish? So we're talking about personal liability here. When you finish working for your employer, when you end your shift each day. See, there's a typo there. When the design strategy is complete, when the design has been constructed, when you reach beer o'clock, all of the above.
When does your liability for design
Well,
finish?
there's another typo. It's supposed
Where?
to say none of the above.
No.
All of the above.
It was before. None of the above is what that should say. So interpret all of the above with none of the above.
All right, well, let's see what people say.
Oh, yeah, it'll pop up. I don't control that.
Yeah. When do you think your job is done?
So consider none of the above instead of all of the above. When you reach beer o'clock, we have 4%.
It's interesting that when you finish working for your employer, that's...
When you finish work for your employer, 76% all of the above. The design has been constructed. Now, that might be because of the commercial relationship, like we talked about, that I've handed over my design, my specifications, my commercial obligations have been fulfilled, right? Do you guys want to comment on this?
Alan?
So the way most safety legislation now works is that liability arises from when the risk is created and then finishes when the risk no longer exists or you cease to be in control. The risk, if you create a design that has in it a risk, an unacceptable risk, and to put that in more palatable language, say you created a design and then the Australian standard, the relevant Australian standard changed and your design would no longer meet the current Australian standards, then you might say there's an unacceptable risk there. When does it finish? Well, it continues until the risk stops. So it might continue for 10 years. And then even though that you've long left your employer, and then the question is, well, do you still have control? So if you're the designer and you say, well, I designed something 10 years ago which wouldn't satisfy Australian standards now, but I no longer work for the company that I was working for back then, what level of control do I have now? What can I do now? And clearly it's going to be limited if you no longer work for the same company, but you can reach out and say, you know, that design we had that we did for the whatever it was that you designed, that should probably be revisited now. That should probably be updated to take into account current standards.
Mr. Prosecutor, past prosecutor.
Oh, look, I think I'd be inclined to agree because there's this expectation of this continuous learning or continuous improving. If you've been reasonable and practicable in your endeavours, because that's what the law asks at that point in time, but as I mentioned before, this lasting creation, somehow it's come to your attention, change in attitudes. At that point in time, the standard was here, but now the standard's here. I think...
or there's been an accident.
Usually there's been the risk has fructified, as they say. It's
materialised.
It's materialised. Then, you
realised.
The shit has hit the fan.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
you might say, look, I never thought that anyone could be injured, but now that this accident has happened, I realise, well, people could be injured and the design should be updated to take that into account.
And environments, when you design environments, it's, could be 20, 50 years that's got an enduring impact. And so if you don't consider a lot of different ways to accommodate people in their tasks, work systems, ecology of people, evolution of people, you've got a lot of workarounds. If you've got capital equipment coming into your business and it's there for 20 years, for example, you've got a lot of workarounds when it's designed poorly. Yeah. Or you really create a legacy, as you talked about. Yeah. You're a good custodian, a good caretaker, a value engineer, and that has effects that trickle down that are positive. And I always like to think about that enduring impact of your design.
Yeah, I just don't think it stops when the thing it has been designed and installed. And the law actually talks about this notion of continuous improvement. And I think professionals you're always alert to improving your standards and your know-how. So, I think even though you can say, look, at that point in time, I was reasonable in all of my approaches, it was done right, it was safety by design, ticked it off. But if things have changed and attitudes have changed and professional opinions have shifted, and that's discovered through some type of risk, then...
And you often tell me about a multidisciplinary approach.
Yep.
So that the types of things I think about might not be what Trajce or Alan think about, and equally, Trajce, Alan, the people who do the work, the people who maintain the system, trying to get opinions from lots of different people as core focus group participants, that multidisciplinary approach. So
yeah, you get in early, so to make sure that you can, hand on heart, say this has been done to the best of our ability. Just one way to demonstrate that is right at the seminal point, right at the early stages. I engaged with various groups, those people who would be using this apparatus, those people would be using this belt. That to me would indicate really being that value-adding engineer, because I didn't just go off and just draw this and to that minimum standard. I sort of added value.
A final statement?
That was it.
That was
Value.
Final statement?
Well, I'll just follow on from what Trajce says. If you're in the position where you're feeling that's not my job, which a lot of professional advisors would think, just make sure your scope of work is clear. So that the scope of work defines what your job is, but more importantly, what your job is not. So if you think about that A&G engineering case or the Wirri Wines case, it would have been great for A&G engineering if they had specifically said to Wirri Wines, we are not going to assess the concrete slab. But they didn't do that. So think about your scope of works.
And if I was Wirri, then I'd go, whoa, okay, who will assess that concrete slab for its footings and its secure
Correct.
hold?
Getting back to communication, cooperation and consultation.
More C words.
Yeah. So
People in process, go for innovation, be a value engineer. I just keep thinking about the impact of what you're doing for an enduring design strategy. Absolutely.
That'd be the...
Educate your mind, 'cause the system will keep you blind.
Ross, do you want questions later or now?
We can do questions now if you like.
All right. Do we have any questions, please?
As we mentioned, it's captured in a recording, so it's a matter for you.
Yeah, if you do speak, we might capture it in the episode recording. So if you want that 15 seconds of fame, bring it. We want it.
Could be the beginning of something new.
That's right. Did anything we say hit home to you? I'm curious about that. Something you've experienced? Anything that you're prepared or can share? You can anonymize any names or events.
Can I ask you, Sarah?
Uh-oh.
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Oh,
Stand back.
All right.
Can I ask you, Sarah, if I'm at a mine and
Often.
whatever it is, if the machine's not quite doing what we want it to do and I make a change to that machine, how much of that duty do I take as a designer?
Oh, such a good question. So does that mean you as a commission designer or the PCBU that makes modifications, which happens all the time, because the minute you make a modification, you become a designer, right? So the minute you become a designer, that's that section 22 that Trajce loves to quote, designer. So you're talking about a commissioned engineer with a known scope of work, or you're just saying, that's a bit dodgy, mate. I'm going to make a little change. I'm going to change the seating. I'm going to change and add a bolt-on extra mirror here. I'm going to, that kind of change?
Yeah.
The latter?
That kind of change, because in the detail, sometimes those little changes can make a bigger change.
Yeah.
And if you find employees, workers making those changes, to me, those are not something wrong per se, even though your liability increases in the designer. Bear with me for a moment. It actually tells me that there's a reason people are trying to make a modification. So that is what I call a near right. And I have probably for 20 years been trying to influence companies, mining organizations to capture near rights, the workarounds that people make. Not just the near misses, but all of the weird, dodgy little modifications people are wanting. There's a reason they want that. They want the system to work better. Most of the times their motivations are actually to make improvements, to be more efficient, to get the core strategy of work done. Those are the design opportunities. That's the thing to capture. That's actually what you want to be investigating all the time, is what are those potential desired or actual workarounds in the business all the time. So yes, you've got to watch the liabilities, but you must learn from it. And if they have made a modification that shouldn't be done, maybe it's an education session too, but not just reprimand, really unpack it. That's an opportunity to investigate further. Good question, Ross.
Anyone else from the floor? Questions? Got a mic, please, somewhere up the front here. Thanks, John.
I'd love to hear from anyone mine that starts tracking their near rights, okay? All of their workarounds, please contact me. I want to see that organization.
Luke Wickleman from Hunter Valley Ops. Just really stood out to me a statement you made about the designer, if they're made aware of a standards change, reach out and talk to the previous employer. What about for us operators? So I think there'd be most people in the room have, let's call it legacy pieces of plant or existing pieces of plant. We know they were constructed to previous standards. Where does that sit in that context?
Well, you as an operator, as a worker, you have a responsibility to exercise reasonable care that your actions don't adversely affect others. So that's where your legal obligation lies. I think, from a practical perspective, if you've got a work health and safety officer on site, that's a good way to communicate. If you don't want to go straight to management, you can talk to whoever is the safety professional on site and try and get them to be your advocate. That's what I would encourage. But there's certainly nothing wrong with going to someone in management and saying, hey, look, I don't think our piece of kit is up to standard these days. We should really have a think about that.
And if I was a manager at the workplace, trying to, or I have statutory obligations as an engineer, I want to know if I have legacy equipment, at least what risks am I inheriting? Right? I need that completely clear and transparent so I can have a better management strategy, because there's a heck of a lot of old stuff that you inherit. I've gone down to mines in Kazakhstan, underground, shafts, and I was sending photos to research supervisors saying, check this out. And they're like, we haven't seen that in Australia for like 100 years. There's a lot of legacy systems that you're going to inherit, right?
Can I just say, Kazakhstan's doing really well in the speed climbing in the Olympics at the moment. They're doing really well.
Kazakhstan, what, sorry?
In the speed climbing in the Olympics.
Speed climbing Olympics, okay.
Must be watching that. So, however, yes, I was just reminding me of Kazakhstan. That's a great point you raise, and your role as being on the ground, I would suggest you could be what I'd call an upstream influencer.
Absolutely.
You would travel. You would bring this information upwards. You let it rise and rise, because it's the right thing to do. Your safety and other safety. Bring it up and communicate. And as Alan said, if you fear that channel may not be conducive to the information, speak to the HSR or speak to the WHOSO.
Psychological safety matters a lot here, and I've gone out many times where the guys want to say something, but they might be a contracted supplier to the mining operator, and there are tensions in being able to mention that. So that's another challenge for this industry, is to erode any of those boundaries and make sure that sense of combination of psychological safety to speak up and psychosocial safety, that the work systems embrace that combination, work well for you.
Yeah. And I know it's hard in the real world, and everyone's time poor and efficiencies. Well, I know all that. I get it. We're here in our ivory tower telling you all this. However, the law doesn't look at it that way. So whilst it's easy for us to pontificate and tell you all this stuff, it's sort of important that you do embrace some of it to keep the conversation going. And I know it's harder. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing your job, and I'm not operating it. I don't design, but I am saying conversation, communication, and to the right ears, it's a duty.
Go ahead, sorry.
I suppose for context, I'm asking from a management, the operator position, what is reasonably practical from a management position to dive into that legacy and manage the legacy that applies or complies to older standards and not the current.
Right.
Where's the line drawn on having to act on that?
Yeah. Okay, so we're seeing it in other areas of safety, and we'll see it a lot in mining soon, which is people are going to jail. Right, so we've got to take it seriously. If you're aware of a risk and you fail to do anything about it, then you expose yourself to the potential of a charge of recklessness or gross negligence, which attracts a jail sentence. So you have to take it seriously. If you know that there's a risk to human safety, you have to take it seriously. That doesn't mean you have to do everything under the sun, but it does mean you have to have a look at that risk and think about what can be done to address that risk. Now, if it's a change in an Australian standard and the expectation in the current Australian standard is higher than when the machine was manufactured, then you really need to take the time to stop and say, well, you know, what's the difference? What's the risk involved in that? What's the exposures to miners and other workers? What do we need to do to address that risk? If you don't do anything, then you expose yourself to far too much legal risk.
P word, not a C word. Proactive. There's an expectation that you be proactive. I prefer the word anticipatory. You anticipate if you know that the standards have changed, but essentially the law's asking persons, plural, you're not all alone, persons, plural, concurrently, to be proactive. It's part of the philosophy of the Act. It's the objective of all these types of health and safety laws, being proactive. And that would be an example, upstreaming that type of information, the flow, especially if it's some type of legacy item of plant. I mean, I've prosecuted some of these rock aggregating belt things. They look like something out of Star Wars. They're just frightening. And obviously they're not to that standard. And of course, it's led to fatalities. So yeah, there is this type of expectation to work together, or collaboratively. There's one I haven't used yet. Collaboration.
You were going to say?
Yeah. Look, I suppose there's probably a few nervous minds turning in the room right now, but I suppose one comment that's thrown around the industry is in terms of meeting current standards with a upgrade or major overhaul. Until that point, a lot of these situations aren't addressed. But anyway, interesting conversation.
If you've got a program in place for improvements, then you're doing something. And that's the big thing. You've got to do something.
What I love is you circled this back to don't overcook and don't undercook the chook.
Yeah, love it.
I think we had do we have time for one more? Because I think...
One more?
Oh, no, we're over.
We're kind of getting...
Yeah, no. Well,
Gabby and Tim probably need to have a chance, but it's been great. Thank you so much, you guys.
We warned
and if you're hanging around tonight, I'm sure some people love to catch up with you guys. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Please thank Sarah, Trajce and Alan. Thanks very much.
Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Create a new path, don't let the people follow your signs. Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Create a new path, don't let the people follow your signs. In my lifetime, I followed the wrong...
We hope you enjoyed that episode of WhyWork. You've been listening to Trajce, Sarah and Alan. And if you'd like to know more about some of the things we've talked about today, please subscribe and we'd be more than happy to provide you with information, names of cases and other things that may interest you. Please be aware that none of the matters we've talked about today should be construed as legal advice or any other type of advice. We're just here to talk about all things related to work. See you next time.
All my life, an authority hater. Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Educate your mind, cause the system will keep you blind. Educate your mind, cause the system